Welcome to the lecture on Epicurus's letter to Menoeceus. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be discussing the issue of death. Specifically, we'll be discussing whether death is bad. We'll be coming at this question of whether death is bad from two different, although intertwined, directions. The first is the factual question of whether death is actually bad. If it is, how is it bad? The second way we'll be coming at this question is from an emotional or psychological perspective, asking, should we be afraid of death? Should we be concerned? Does death matter in the sort of way that it should affect our lives, our life projects, the way we live before death? Get used to believing that death is nothing to us. For all good and bad consists in sense experience, and death is the privation of sense experience. Hence, a correct knowledge of the fact that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life a matter for contentment, not by adding a limitless time to life, but by removing the longing for immortality. For there is nothing fearful in life for one who has grasped that there is nothing fearful in the absence of life. Thus, he is a fool who says that he fears death not because it will be painful when present, but because it is painful when it is still to come. For that which, while present, causes no distress, causes unnecessary pain when merely anticipated. So death, the most frightening of bad things, is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not yet present, and when death is present, then we do not exist. Therefore, it is relevant neither to the living nor to the dead, since it does not affect the former, and the latter do not exist. We can sum up much of what Epicurus is saying here in a famous and more pithy statement of this quotation. When we are, death is not. When death is, we are not. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher who lived from 341 to 270 BCE. He was an atomic materialist. This is a notion of what the ultimate constituents of reality are. They're atoms, which are things that can't be broken down any further, and they are essentially material in nature. He was a religious skeptic. He was a questioner of religious claims. And he was a founder of the doctrine that takes his name, Epicureanism. Epicureanism is a complicated doctrine that's sometimes misunderstood as a form of base hedonism that says pleasure is the only thing that matters. Epicurus did say that sense experience gave us the only things that could possibly matter, but pleasure, in his account, isn't mere bodily pleasure. It's much more complicated than this. Since what we're doing in this discussion is talking about a practical ethical matter, one that deals with a specific component of our lived experience, we should look at the subdiscipline of philosophy known as practical ethics. Practical ethics, which is sometimes also called applied ethics, is the subdiscipline of philosophical ethics that concerns itself with the moral properties and moral reasons surrounding specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs. So the practical ethicist is primarily concerned with the moral properties possessed by specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs, but isn't primarily concerned with general theories of ethics that determine right or wrong, or good or bad, or better or worse. So notice that this term practical means exactly what it seems to mean. In practice, practical ethics deals with the things that we actually confront in our daily lives. Some of the questions asked by the practical ethicist are, what's the moral status of specific sorts of sexual activity? What's the moral status of abortion? How should we treat non-human animals? What are the right and wrong ways for a nation to conduct a war? What is the moral status of specifically race-related questions? What is the moral status of specifically gender-related questions? And what makes our specific sorts of lives go well or badly? This final question is the question that we'll be concerned with mostly in this lecture, since death is part of our specific sorts of lives. We want to know whether death makes our lives worse. It's important in understanding practical ethics to recognize how practical ethics is related to, but nonetheless distinct from, a philosophical subdiscipline known as existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical and literary movement that began mainly in Germany and France in the late 19th century. Thinkers such as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre are among existentialism's most prominent figures, even though some of these thinkers rejected the name existentialism. Existentialism requires a radically individualistic, although not generally self-centered or egotistical or egoistic, methodology that's known as phenomenology. Existentialism is in many ways a philosophy of living, where living refers to the specific sort of thing that self-conscious, rational creatures like you and I do. While practical ethics generally gives us guidelines for how to live in terms of being good human people, and thus could be considered some sort of a philosophy of living, it nearly always ignores a phenomenological or first-personal or subjective methodology and is more concerned with moral principles than with individual experience. So, while we could have a practical ethics that's a form of existentialism, usually the way that practical ethics is investigated, studied, researched in the Anglo-American world is in terms of an objective, universal, general methodology rather than the subjective, individualistic, phenomenological methodology found in existentialism. Since what we're concerned with here is death, we should get clear on what we mean here by death. Here we aren't concerned with metaphysical or religious questions concerning whether persons are more than their mere bodies, or whether there's some part of a person that could persist beyond bodily death. These are very interesting questions in their own right, but we shouldn't confuse them with our central topic. Death, as we'll use the term here, refers to permanent annihilation of the subject. If I die, then I'm gone. Now note that this is a stipulative definition. I'm saying this is how we'll use the term death in this lecture. No metaphysical questions turn on using the term in this specific way. I won't make any arguments about religious or metaphysical theses from this stipulative definition of death. Now, if someone thinks that after bodily death we still exist in some way, then that person thinks that bodily death isn't real death, isn't death in our sense of the word. If somebody thinks that some part of us is immortal, then that person thinks that we never actually die in the sense that we're using the term death in this lecture. Thus, when we talk about death, what we're referring to is one and only one very specific thing: permanent annihilation of the subject being no more. We can take a humorous look at this notion of death in a very famous sketch from Monty Python.
Hello, I wish to register a complaint. Hello, miss.
What do you mean, miss?
I'm sorry, I have a cold. I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
No, it's resting, look.
Look, my lad, I know a dead parrot when I see one, and I'm looking at one right now.
No, it's not dead, it's resting.
Resting?
Yeah. Remarkable bird, the Norwegian blue. Beautiful plumage, isn't it?
The plumage don't enter into it. It's stone dead.
No, it's resting.
All right, then. If it's resting, I'll wake it up. Hello, Polly. I got a nice cuttlefish for you when you wake up, Polly Parrot.
There, it moved.
No, it didn't. That was you pushing the gate.
I did not.
Yes, you did. Hello, Polly. Polly. Polly Parrot, wake up. Polly. Now, that's what I call a dead parrot.
No, it's stunned.
Look, my lad, I've had just about enough of this. That parrot is definitely deceased. And when I bought it not half an hour ago, you assured me that its lack of movement was due to it being tired and shagged out after a long squat.
It's got me pining for the fjords.
Pining for the fjords? What kind of talk is that? Look, where did it fall flat on its back the moment I got it home?
The Norwegian blue prefers kipping on its back. It's a beautiful bird, lovely plumage.
Look, I took the liberty of examining that parrot, and I discovered that the only reason that it had been sitting on its perch in the first place was that it had been nailed there.
Well, of course it was nailed there, otherwise it muscled up to those bars and boom!
Look, matey. This parrot wouldn't boom if I put 4,000 bolts through it. It's bleeding demise.
It's not, it's pining.
It's not pining, it's passed on. This parrot is no more. It has ceased to be. It's expired and gone to meet its maker. This is a late parrot. It's a stiff. Bereft of life, it rests in peace. If you hadn't nailed it to the perch, it would be pushing up the daisies. It's run down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-parrot.
Well, I better replace it then.
It'll help to get clear on this notion of death if we contrast three different concepts with one another. These are the concepts of being dead, death, and dying. The concepts that we use that surround the issue of death can be used imprecisely or equivocally. So it's very important when we start talking about the notion of death. If we want to do good philosophical work and arrive at correct or justified conclusions about death, that we're using words very precisely. Here's how we'll use these words here. Being dead is the state one is in after one has died, after one's death. One is no longer around when they're dead. Death, on the other hand, is the instant when one dies, when one passes from being alive to being dead. However, death is also used oftentimes to refer to the state of being dead. It's generally used in this second sense, in fact. Context generally makes clear how the concept of death is being used, whether it's being used in terms of the instant when we pass from being alive to being dead, or whether it's being used in the same way as the concept of being dead. Dying, in contrast, is the process undergone by the living that is a lead-up to death. No dying person is dead. Now, of course, in a poetic sort of way, we're all dying since we are all growing closer to death. Usually, however, the concept of dying is used to refer to the final bits of a living person's death. So a dying person is alive. Then death happens, and they become dead. Many people think that death is a bad thing. When we're talking about the badness of death, we can break that notion of badness into two different issues, a philosophical issue and an emotional or psychological issue. Let's first talk about this philosophical issue. Many people think that there's something bad about death. And it's not just that death makes survivors sad. In fact, it's the badness of death that makes people sad, not the other way around. But if death is actually bad, then we should be able to find some reason why death is bad. If death is bad, it's bad because of something. Call this the philosophical question of the badness of death. What is it that makes death bad? One way to examine this question, and the way that's been most influential in the practical philosophical study of death, has been to look at the sorts of things that make other human endeavors bad, and then to see whether death possesses those things, or at least things that are relevantly similar to those things. Human endeavors are bad, or go badly for a number of reasons. Chief among these reasons are someone is or some people are harmed, or there's a lack of some good thing that should otherwise be present, and someone is or some people are deprived of something that would be better for them not to be deprived of. This is the philosophical issue of the badness of death. Contrast this with the emotional or psychological issue of the badness of death. In addition to, and perhaps largely independent of the philosophical question concerning the badness of death, there's also this emotional question. Many, perhaps most people, have negative emotions about death, especially about their own death. These emotions are generally related to fear and anxiety. The emotional question concerning the badness of death is whether our negative emotions concerning death are apt, or whether those emotions are misplaced. Now, of course, emotion is less susceptible to reason and argumentation than is belief. However, we shouldn't think that good reasons can't offer us comfort concerning something that we thought was bad, or even show us the way to feel much less bad or even good about something that we previously had negative emotions with respect to. So, for example, imagine that you're afraid of something, and somebody shows you a number of good reasons why you shouldn't be afraid of that thing. That might not automatically make your emotions of fear go away, but it would surely provide you with some comfort and might eventually, if you focused on those reasons, make your fear of that thing go away. Is death a harm? This is a first way that we might ask the philosophical question of the badness of death, and a way into asking the emotional question of the badness of death. Harm is usually considered in both consequentialistic and sensory terms, such that a person is harmed when the consequences of some action or inaction result in negative sensory states, generally pain, but also lack of pleasure on the part of that person. Now, dying can be very painful, and since death is the end state of the process of dying, this gives us good reason to think that there's some relationship between death and harm. Further, when a person is dead, they can no longer experience pleasure. That gives us even more reason to think that there is some relationship between death and harm. However, we need to be very careful here. As we've already noted, dying and death are not the same thing. Neither are dying and being dead. So the fact that dying can be painful doesn't by itself entail that death is painful or that death is a harm. Recall that it's very important to distinguish being dead the instant of death, and dying when talking about the purported badness of death. Even further, since death is the end of the suffering of dying, even though dying might generally be painful or unpleasant to the person who is dying, death, and subsequently being dead, puts an end to that suffering. Isn't that perhaps some reason to think that the harm of dying doesn't transfer over into a harm in death? Well, what about this thought that death is a privation, that death is a lack of something? Could this make sense of why we think that death is bad? Privation is the lack of something, something's being missing. And death is a lack of all sorts of things. Chief among the things is life. Thus, we might formulate what we can call a privation account of the badness of death as follows. 1. Life is good. 2. Death is the privation of or lack of life. 3. Death is the privation of something good. This just follows from 1 and 2. 4. Anything that's the privation of something good is, itself, bad. Therefore, death is bad. Now, a clarification on this first premise that life is good. That first premise isn't claiming that all lives are good, or that life is always good. One's merely claiming that lives are generally, on balance, positive. However, we'd actually need to evaluate each particular life individually before applying this argument to that particular life. Now, the central premise of this argument is 4, that anything that is the privation of something good is, itself, bad. But is 4 true? There are all sorts of things that are good, but the privation of those things is also good. So it doesn't seem to be the case that if you've got a good thing, and that good thing isn't present, that therefore bad stuff is occurring. Consider an example. Riding a horse, that's great. But not riding a horse can also be great. Eating a hamburger, that might be great. But not eating a hamburger, if instead you're eating a hot dog, that might also be great. So the fact that something good is missing doesn't entail that something bad is occurring. We'd need much more to give the privation account some sort of purchase, some sort of good strength, some reason behind it to believe that death is a bad thing. Well, what about a more specific version of a privation account that we can call the deprivation account? The deprivation account of the badness of death is currently very popular in practical ethical discussions about the badness of death. The deprivation account is distinct from the privation account, in that the privation account claims that some good thing is missing from the world in general, while the deprivation account says that some particular person doesn't have some good thing. The deprivation account claims that death deprives a person of life, but specifically the good things that happen in life, experiences, successes, relationships, etc. To be deprived of these things is a bad thing, thus, death is a bad thing. However, consider, when you or I are deprived of something, someone, namely you or I, still exists to be deprived of that thing. When I don't give you a candy bar, for example, you're still around after I don't give you the candy bar, but you're now candy bar deprived. However, when a person dies it's not as though there's still someone around who's being deprived of the good things in life. How would it be that a person could be deprived of the good things in life when they don't even exist anymore? This criticism of the deprivation account gets us to something very similar to Epicurus's argument. Epicurus's main claim is that death is not bad. Now we'll need to see what he means by this and why he thinks this. Here's a formalized version of Epicurus's argument. Premise 1. For any particular person, call that person S. S's death is the permanent end of sensory experience for that person, S. This just seems true given how we've defined death as permanent annihilation. Premise 2. If something is the permanent end of sensory experience for some person, S, then S has no sensory experience at that time or after that time. This just seems to follow. Thus, for any person, S has no sensory experience at or after her death. That's a conclusion of 1 and 2. But for any person, S, some event, call it E, can only be good or bad for that person, S, if S has sensory experience of E. Thus, for any person, S, at or after S's death is not bad for S, and for any person, S, if at or after S's death is not bad for S, then death is not bad. Therefore, our conclusion that follows from 1 through 6 is that death is not bad. One of the main things doing the work in this argument is premise 4. For a person, some event can only be good or bad if the person can have sensory experiences of that event. And since we know that there are no sensory experiences at or after death, death can't be bad. This is a compelling argument. Death can't harm you. It can't deprive you of things. It can't be bad for you, according to Epicurus's picture of what badness is, because when you are around, you're not dead. And when death is around, you're not around anymore. Here's an initial worry with what Epicurus is claiming here. Epicurus relativizes badness. Notice that, according to Epicurus, bad things are bad things for specific individuals. Thus, nothing is just bad, bad period, bad full stop, or in philosophical language, bad simplicator. But while we can admit that some, perhaps many, of the bad things that happen are bad for specific people, is it the case, we should ask, that all bad things are bad for specific people? That is it the case that all badness can be reduced to badness for specific individuals or specific sets of individuals? If there's such a thing as badness that's not badness for a specific individual, then we might say that even though death is not bad for the person who dies, death is still bad. Not bad for anyone, but just bad, period. Consider, would it be bad for a person to burn down a forest for no reason, even if doing that wasn't bad for some sentient creatures? Now, most people would say yes. But if it would be bad to do that, even though it's not bad for anyone, then it looks like we have a notion of bad, period, bad simplicator that doesn't rely on someone's actually experiencing badness. Or consider, would it be bad to cheat on an exam, even if it wasn't bad for any specific person or people? Most people would say yes. But if it can be bad to do something, even though it's not bad for any specific individuals, then we've got a notion of badness, period. Or consider, would it be bad to steal from a large company, even if there were no negative effects for any specific individuals or groups? Many people would say yes. But if it's bad to do it, without it being bad for any specific person, then it seems like we have a notion of badness that isn't relativized to specific individuals. Thus, couldn't we agree with Epicurus that death isn't bad for the person who dies? However, it's nonetheless bad. Here's a second worry. Epicurus makes badness and goodness entirely dependent on sensory states. States of hearing or seeing or smelling or touching, tasting, etc. Epicurus's overarching moral theory is a version of, albeit a complex and entirely non-standard version, of hedonism. Hedonism is the position that pleasure is the primary moral good, and that pain or a lack of pleasure is the primary moral bad. And what that means is that there are no good or bad things that aren't experienced by something that can experience good or bad. Now, certainly, it's plausible that many of the good things are things that are experienced, and many of the bad things are things that are experienced. However, doesn't it also seem plausible that there are some good or bad things that aren't experienced, that are bad just because of the sort of thing that they are, and not bad because of how they make somebody feel? So consider. Most people think that it's good for me to respect you, and not because of how respect makes you feel or how it makes me feel, but instead because respect is a good way of treating another person. But if respect can be good, independent of how it makes anybody feel, then there are such things as goodness and badness that are not dependent on sensory states. Further, most people think that it would be bad for you to break a promise or for you to be unfaithful, commit infidelity perhaps. Not because of how it would make somebody feel, but because promise keeping, fidelity, those are good things in themselves. But if we've got a notion of good things in themselves and bad things in themselves, then there are good and bad things that don't rely on sensory state. So thus, couldn't we agree with Epicurus that there's no sensation of badness that comes from death, of course, but death is nonetheless a bad thing? Not bad because it's an experience, but just bad, period. These two problems, that of the sensory nature of badness and that of the relativity of badness in Epicurus's account, should make us suspicious of Epicurus's general claim that death is not bad, ever, period. We can agree with Epicurus about a lot of what he says, but we should be worried about the general overarching claim that he's making. Now that we've looked at this philosophical notion of the badness of death, let's return to the emotional question of the badness of death. since we haven't paid very much attention to that yet. Recall that the emotional question of the badness of death is the question of whether being worried about or fearing death is apt for us. A contemporary and sophisticated defender of Epicurus's argument against the badness of death might say something like the following. Look, I agree that things can be bad apart from being experienced. I agree that things can be bad in themselves. What I want to claim is that death is never bad as an experience for the person who is dead. And that is not a trivial thesis. Why is it that it's not trivial that death is never bad as an experience for the person who's dead? Well, recall that people are generally terrified and anxious about their own death. Is there a good reason to feel this way about our own death? This is what we're calling the emotional problem. Now, perhaps, even though Epicurus's argument isn't bulletproof with respect to the philosophical question, it is very strong with respect to the emotional question. Perhaps Epicurus's argument is instead intended to solve the emotional problem and not the purely philosophical problem. Epicurus does say this, recall, but the many sometimes flee death as the greatest of bad things and sometimes choose it as a relief from the bad things in life. But the wise man neither rejects life nor fears death, for living does not offend him, nor does he believe not living to be something bad. And just as he does not unconditionally choose the largest amount of food, but the most pleasant food, so he savors not the longest time, but the most pleasant. Perhaps what Epicurus is telling us here is that in order to live a good life, we should recognize that fearing death in life makes our lives worse, and that we have no good reason to feel that way, to make our lives worse by fearing death. In this lecture, we've taken a look at Epicurus's famous argument against the badness of death in his letter to Menoeceus. Epicurus's argument can be summed up as follows. When death is, I am not. When I am, death is not. Now we saw that this might not be a solution to the philosophical problem of the badness of death, because it might be that there are things that are bad independent of whether somebody experiences them. It might be that badness is not always relativized to individuals as badness for some specific person. There might be a non-relativized, non-experiential version of badness, and in that way, death might nonetheless be bad. However, it does seem that if we're fearing things because we think we have good reason to fear those things, then we may have made a mistake with respect to fearing death. And if fearing death while we're alive makes our lives worse, that's plenty good reason to try as hard as we can not to fear death. Thank you.